Okay, so I've sort of come here just to share a little bit about my experience of having dyslexia and how that's affected my working life. And so I'm just going to tell you a little bit about that. So I qualified as a physio in 1987, and at present I'm working as a community physiotherapist as part of an integrated therapy team. And I have dyslexia, and my eyesight isn't fabulous either, and the combination of those two things means that I can't actually drive. I wasn't diagnosed with having dyslexia until just before taking my O-levels, and that's because I had a really astute English teacher for the time who sort of discussed with my parents her concern that even though I was bright and able verbally, my written work was appalling, and even though my mum went through all my spellings every night for absolutely every subject of my work, I was obviously having great difficulty. At this time, I don't think dyslexia, and certainly in my school and the LEA I was in, wasn't sort of an issue, or wasn't really talked about, wasn't at the forefront of anything. And so the school and the LEA didn't sort of have any procedures in place sort of to look at why I might be having these difficulties. So they advised my parents to send me to a private ed psych, who assessed me and said, sort of gave me the diagnosis of dyslexia based on my IQ, which was high, but my written work was appalling and got even worse under stress, and sort of also had visual perceptual problems as well. And then as a result of that, I was given sort of extra time for my O-levels and my A-levels, and I did my exams on a separate table with a lamp to help with my visual. So that was kind of where I got with my school. I did actually really well for my O-levels and A-levels, so that was great. And I then decided to, sort of during that time, to train as a physio. At that time, I didn't realise that the educational psychologist had really advised my parents strongly not for me to do A-levels or go on to further education, because they thought I'd find it too stressful. Luckily, they didn't tell me, but just supported me in my decisions. So one of the things I think people are thinking or wanting to think about is sort of the procedure for applying for becoming a healthcare profession with something like dyslexia. So really at that time, because it wasn't recognised, it didn't even come up in the interviews. I don't know if the school wrote anything in their reports about me. So it wasn't a question of disclosure or not disclosure. It just wasn't anything that anybody ever really talked about. And to be honest, even though I had been given that diagnosis, I tended just to shrug it off and not take any notice about that. So just a little bit, probably it might be interesting just to know that sort of in my school before I got to that stage, I had quite a tricky time really, because it's the typical problems of being told off for failing in spelling tests, getting 0 out of 20 or 1 out of 20, even though I tried to learn them. Really struggling with copying things off the board, and so I'd be sort of perceived as being slow. So it's the whole thing of when you're looking at the board and then you try and write it down, you just can't do it, and the more stressed you get, the harder it gets. So I would often have to sort of stay in to try and do that. So that I was sort of told off for being lazy and careless. I remember having to go to the head teachers once because I'd been a bit naughty, but she also had my rough book. And there was a group of us that had been naughty, but I was made to stay behind afterwards and really blasted for having such appalling handwriting and told it was disgusting, and she went on and on about it. So that's just I think because people then just didn't really realise the implications of dyslexia. So when I got to college, actually things in some ways became harder. Though school didn't give me any strategies for helping to learn, I just kind of worked them out for myself. At college, it was Polytechnic then, Coventry Poly. I found things hard because in the lectures, again, it was people talking, trying to write it down, which I found incredibly hard. And trying to look at the board and write things down again, I found hard. And whereas at school, especially sort of in the sixth form, I had 1 or 2 really good friends who I knew well, they would always give me their notes after every lesson, and I would then have to spend the extra time writing their notes and putting them in a way that I could learn. I couldn't really use anything that I'd written down in the class time because it never made sense. It was just a load of, I couldn't even read my own writing basically. So at college it was sort of new people, and people were actually quite competitive, and there wasn't really a sense of being aware of those issues. And so even the girls that I lived with sort of weren't prepared to let me look at their notes because they thought I'd be just sort of copying and using them. So that was really quite hard, and it didn't occur to me to go and talk it over with anybody. I also found it very hard just rote learning sort of muscles, which was kind of what all the anatomy was in the first year, because the way I like to learn is really understanding. So if I can understand a concept and sort of see it through, that's fine. If I'm actually just having to look at a word and memorise it, that's hopeless. So I have issues with remembering names. Visual perception is really hard. So that just sort of, I might be told someone's name, but it won't stick even if I read it several times or write it clearly. So that kind of learning for me was really hard. And in the exams, at the end of the year, what we call part ones, then there was no indication that I'd be given extra time. So I just kind of went along with that, really. In the second year, sort of in the clinical field, things sort of came to a bit of a head. I obviously got quite stressed, and things were kind of okay until I had a problem in one of my placements, which was kind of linked to the difficulties I had with dyslexia. And then on the next placement, it was outpatients, and I found that really, really hard. And so I decided that perhaps this wasn't the job for me, for other reasons as well. And at that point, I think I think people realised that I must be struggling. But again, though they let me have a sort of week off to think things over, and at the end of the week I thought, no, I really, really want to do physio, but nothing was then really put in place to help or support me. And I think it's just because that wasn't what happened in those days, and there wasn't a technology. So I just plodded on, and I got through my training. And again, for my finals, there was no assistance at all for the exams, no extra time as I'd had in O-levels and A-levels. That wasn't seemed to be appropriate. I think I may have discussed it with my tutor, and they just said, well, you've just got to cope in the real world, basically. So that's kind of what I did. So I passed and went and had my first job. Yeah, so moving into work, it was very easy to get jobs those days. I think I had several job offers, and then because I was getting married, just went to the job that was most convenient to where we planned to live. And to be honest, I think having managed to get through O-levels, A-levels, and all my training, which as a physio was very hard because you had to do all the academic stuff as well as working, and lots of travelling and things. I think if you can get through that amount, then yeah, going into the working world, you're kind of there really. So again, in those days, there wasn't the technology or anything, so you just expected to just do to work, and so you just take it on yourself to take long. You're going to take longer doing everything. You know that there are certain things that are going to stress you, so you try and work out strategies to help. I would always stay late, writing things up later, so I'd have to do things in rough and then write them up, especially in outpatients. I think probably that was probably the main strategy. There wasn't really much else, or I probably took stuff home quite a lot. Yes, so I just kind of muddled through and really put the whole dyslexia thing, I'd say, behind me. And did my what we called rotations in those days, and then got my job in paediatrics, which actually in some ways was a real relief because you're not working in the acute system, and you're spending much more time with parents and families, and it's much more empathetic, sort of having an empathy, and those kind of skills can come through then. And in those days you weren't expected to be rushed. You expect to give people time, and if they needed a cup of tea, and that was acceptable. It's not now, but in those days that was fine. And so rather than trying to see people every 10 minutes in outpatients and having several people going, at the same time and rushing from one cubicle to another. You just had to pace yourself to relate to children and families. So that was better. And I worked for a while at the Children's Hospital in Birmingham again, which was very research orientated and very much a calm atmosphere and taking time. So there weren't really any issues there. And then did several other little jobs just due to sort of personal circumstances. And then the next big long job I had for 15 years was working in a residential school. So really dyslexia wasn't an issue there because you could pace yourself. But it was there that I began to actually face up the fact that I might have a problem, because I think you don't want to be different to anybody else, and you don't want to make song and dance for everything. You just think, this is me, this is the way I am. And one or two things came to a head that weren't anything to do with dyslexia. And the head of that school, who was an English teacher, I'd gone to sort of see her and chat stuff over. She said, you do remarkably well for somebody that has dyslexia. And I almost burst into tears then, because I thought, how did you know? And B, I thought, well, if I haven't actually told somebody, then I must actually have a problem. So that was kind of like one of those moments that you remember, and I thought, oh, well, that's really useful to know. Whereas I think before that, I just hadn't, even though I'd had help in O-levels and A-levels, nobody'd ever really, apart from the educational psychologist, sort of actually acknowledged that I had a problem. It hadn't really been acknowledged. So that was useful. It didn't mean that my working practice changed, but this was sort of before the days of PCs. So you would write all your reports in hand, by hand, and then the secretary would type them up, and they were lovely. They got to know the way my handwriting and all my little abbreviations and things, and that was fine. So really, I just trundled along. I got a similar job when we moved in a residential school, and things just ticked along okay. I was very much aware that I would take longer than other people. I got to grips much more with IT in that job. The previous school hadn't had computers. This school did. But I found once I was shown what to do, I picked things up quite easily. And I think the thing I find hard and still find incredibly hard is speed of typing and having thoughts and then trying to type. That I find that difficult. But that it was fine again. I was able to pace myself. Unfortunately, that school was closed, and I've just recently been redeployed into the community, which has been lovely in many ways. But I think I have felt the most dyslexic in my life under the pace and pressure of working in a totally different environment, which made things come to a head a wee bit, or more than a wee bit, and I had to go and see occupational health, and they advised that I need to talk to Access to Work about it. So that's kind of where I am now. I would say if it's something you want to do, just go for it, and there is so much more support now for guys that if I can manage it, then you can manage it. One thing I kind of thought was when I came to the established trainers' days for students, there was a workshop on dyslexia, I think, and the lady that was leading it said, can you get into small groups and discuss what are the positive things about having a student that has dyslexia with you? And everybody's reaction in my group was just really negative. They said, well, I can't think of anything positive, and that really upset me. And so I then thought of all the things that I think people with dyslexia have that are positive, and when you've had something like that and you've had to work through, I said, well, people with dyslexia will have great perseverance. They will have much more empathy with people because they've had to cope with something that's hard. They'll be absolutely brilliant at problem solving. They'll be really good at thinking out of the box. They'll be much better at seeing the whole picture of things, and they'll be used to developing other ways of doing things, where somebody that hasn't got that problem may not have had to do. So that was things. If you have dyslexia, I'd say you have the potential of developing all those gifts. And in spite of, and perhaps not in spite of, but because of your problems or your difficulties, you've got lots of other positive things to offer. So I would encourage you to go for it.